It's a pleasure being here. It's my first time to the Czech Republic, and I'm suitably impressed. It's a beautiful city, beautiful country.
I already attacked Professor that it's the American arrogance to be for the first time in Prague.
At least it's before I'm dead. I mean, in any event, it is a pleasure being here. Let me see if I can work this correctly. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to speak on the science and politics of global warming, and I apologize immediately, but it's from an American perspective. As you know, climate change is normal. Climate hysteria is not. Climate hysteria, in my view, is a classic example of how what is called capturing a narrative can turn absurd conjectures into presumptive truth. Essentially, capturing a narrative involves getting your story out first and repeating it incessantly. This was known to Goebbels, it was known to Lewis Carroll. It's a good technique. Now, capturing the narrative was a major undertaking, and there's one person who was an example of someone who was heavily involved in this, a fellow named Michael Oppenheimer. In 1990, he wrote this book with a co-author, Robert Boyle. It was called The Race Against the Greenhouse Effect, Dead Heat. This was 1990, remember? It's almost 30 years ago. Virtually everything it predicted has failed to occur, but it remains the template for hysteria. Oppenheimer is now a professor at Princeton University after spending most of his career at the Environmental Defense Fund. He is a co-founder of something called Climate Action Network. This is something you've probably never heard of, but it's a coordinating body for over 1,100 anti-CO2 non-government organizations in over 120 countries. The organization began well before 1990, and incidentally, how many of you know the name Jim Hansen? Okay. He was one of the earlier promoters of hysteria. He was at NASA, Goddard Institute for Space Studies. They had lost their funding from NASA and were desperate. And Oppenheimer was a review panelist for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which replaced NASA's funding for Jim Hansen in order for him to change to climate. Boyle, the second author here, was a journalist for Sports Illustrated. Okay, another important example of the false narrative is the work of someone who claimed to be a Pulitzer Prize winner. It's typical, you find the world full of people claiming prizes they never won. The most common thing is for working with the IPCC, you get a certificate, as I have received, thanking you for contributing to their efforts, but telling you not to call yourself a Nobel Prize winner. Nevertheless, many people do. At any rate, Gelbspan wrote this book in order to show that anyone who opposed alarmism was supported by the fossil fuel industry. This was utterly libelous. He used, for instance, an example which Vaclav may know. Cato Institute has a magazine called Regulation Magazine. I had given a talk at Tel Aviv University and wrote it up for Regulation. They paid me $200 for this article. And 5 years prior to this, they had received 1% of their funding from ExxonMobil. This was considered proof that I had been paid for by ExxonMobil. At any rate, his book continues to be cited as proof by campaigners like Gore and Naomi Oreskes, which some of you know. There's a blogger, Russell Cook, who's made it his mission to expose this, but the truth is no scientist slandered by Gelbspan has the resources in America to seek legal remedy. So you're sort of stuck with these things. Okay. Pushing the wrong thing. I don't know. Trying to. Yeah, for the record, in the US, as far as I can estimate, the total amount of money spent on skepticism, essentially since 1990, is about on the order of $100 million, and that includes think tanks. Environmental groups have spent in the billions of dollars, and the US government has spent $166 billion on climate based on the assumption of imminent danger. Okay, the role of climate change in the recent American election was interesting. It was very low-key, very subdued. You had Trump, who was dismissive of climate, referring to it as a Chinese hoax or something. But Clinton also treated the issue with caution, and the caution increased in the course of the campaign. I think there was a general awareness that this is not a scientific issue. It's almost entirely political. It's not even an environmental issue. You know, from the beginning, the evidence and the motivation have been clear. You have energy, which is a multi-trillion-dollar sector of the American economy, and globally, of course, comparably important. Just like with other sectors like healthcare and so on that are very large, there's always a temptation for control over society, whether it's by states or the EU or the UN, all of which have claimed that this is an opportunity, as one person said, for global governance. But as a side benefit, once you have trillions of dollars involved, you have immense opportunities for what are called enthusiastic crony capitalists. Many people can figure out how to profit from this. And in addition, in the US, as far as science went, the issue arose at the end of the Cold War. And science and technology were looking for a new major cause to justify funding. There's something that George Bernard Shaw pointed out long ago. A government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul. And I think that's happened a great deal. In any event, the idea that climate could be a key to government takeover of the energy sector actually began to take hold in the 60s. And although there were several predecessors to global cooling, there was an initial phase where they were concerned with decreasing oxygen, but that didn't last long. Global cooling was important till the 70s. And this was alleged concern over a coming ice age. The alarm shifted from global cooling to global warming in the 1980s, and the fact that it could shift so easily should have provided ample evidence that the issue was not climate per se, especially since in both cases the villain, which is market control of the energy sector, and the solution, government control, remained essentially the same, regardless of whether it was dangerous cooling or warming. In any event, it should have been, it should have been evident that the issue was not environmental other than as a vehicle for NGO fundraising. The same environmental movement, and here's something peculiar to the States. For instance, there was a dam to be constructed in Tennessee, Tellico Dam, and the construction was halted because a small minnow called the snail darter would have been harmed. And At the same time, the same movement doesn't care. It's gotten special permission to kill over 1 million birds and bats each year with allegedly sustainable wind turbines. The last election, for instance, in the state of Washington, had on the agenda a carbon tax, and it was designed to be what was called revenue neutral. And the environmental movement fought against this tax, presumably because it was, not so much a matter of saving the environment, but squeezing more taxes out of citizens. In any event, finally, given the obvious benefits of energy, reducing access to energy is nothing short of malicious. And this is precisely what the war on fossil fuels, as well as nuclear and hydro, does. I mean, it's often been noted that the environmental movement likes any source of energy, provided that it doesn't work. Virtually every measure of human welfare improves with energy usage. There are a few examples here. But, gross national product per capita, literacy rate, infant mortality. You may question whether children per woman is necessarily an indicator of things improving. But regardless, the period over which these advances occurred, the greenhouse impact of anthropogenic greenhouse gases had grown to almost the equivalent of a doubling of CO2. I mean, certainly no evidence of societal damage from this. The science is irrelevant. That this is the case is illustrated by what I call bait and switch tactics. And what this means is the following. You issue a statement, and the bait in this case is the correct statement that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and will likely cause some warming of the Earth. But the fact of the matter is it has no dangerous implication. You replace this bait by unfounded claims that the warming and other effects of CO2 will be catastrophic. And that does not logically follow. You saw this very well when the IPCC, let me go back, issued the statement that they're 90% certain that most of the warming of the last 50 years was due to man. Now, if you calculate what would be the impact of 100% of the warming of the last 50 years due to man, you would conclude that the system was not very sensitive and that there was very small likelihood of any danger. But because you don't point this out, the politicians can say, see, we must do something. The end of the world is coming. And that's an advertising trick. It's a symptom of false advertising. You use one piece of thing and use the public ignorance to say it implies something else. Now, in fact, there is good scientific evidence that added CO2 will be a net benefit to the Earth. The media hyperventilate, they exaggerate statistically insignificant temperature changes of a small fraction of a degree. Scientific societies proclaim the reality of the greenhouse effect with occasional speculations about potential danger. But none of these groups complain when activists replace these innocent claims with claims of catastrophe. And that's the devil's bargain between science and the advocates. Even well-informed people who are perfectly comfortable with the science of the so-called bait, but who object to the switched and unfounded message of imminent catastrophe, are generally lumped into the 97% who agree. And it's presumed they agree with catastrophism, which is generally not true. What one has done, which is typical in environmental issues, one conflates something where if a lot occurs, let's say you warm 10 degrees, if that is dangerous, then you're to presume any warming, however small, is dangerous. And that's a trap that we commonly get into. The Greeks understood this trap when they said the poison is in the amount. In any event, this is not a new event. It's not new. You had the conflation of evolution, Darwin's evolution theory, with social Darwinism in the early part of the 20th century. And the political agenda associated with social Darwinism was eugenics. And that led to horror stories ranging from the American Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, as well as the implementation of thousands of forced sterilizations in the US as a result of these issues, and of course with the National Socialist racist policies. You know, by now I think the identification of social Darwinism with Darwinism is considered blatantly false. But, you know, similarly, I think for the climate claims. The observed warming is small compared to normal variability experienced by us and far from unprecedented. I always like to show this graph. I'm wondering if, yeah, here, I can use this. You know, this is something that appears every day in our local newspaper, the Boston Globe. And what it shows is, for the preceding 30 days, it shows the dark blue lines, which are the lines connecting the high and low temperature for the day. And then the dark gray, if it's, I don't see if it looks dark. Yeah, it does, looks great. The dark gray is the climatologically averaged high and low for the day. And the light gray are the record-breaking highs and lows for the day. And then there is a line in the middle, a red line, and the thickness of this line corresponds to the change in global mean temperature over the past 150 years. Next time you hear somebody say they can feel global warming, treat it with skepticism. The making of the global temperature sausage is an interesting issue. And the only person to really go through it was a guy called Grotch. He died in the 90s and did this. Now, what you see here is a scatter plot, and each point is a temperature anomaly, annually mean temperature anomaly for a station. And you get the global mean temperature anomaly. I'll explain what that is if you want. By averaging this. So this looks like a mess. It's between roughly -2 and 2 degrees centigrade with scatter outside. If you average it on the same scale, what you get is the second curve. And I would suggest that most scientists would conclude that the deviations have pretty much canceled out. So what you do is you stretch the scale by a factor of 10. Now it's essentially minus range 0.2 to 2 minus 0.2 to 2. But you have in this random fluctuations, and they are essentially noise, and they're essentially telling you that you can't really tell much beyond plus or minus 0.2 centigrade. You can get slightly less noise if you use ocean data, but the accuracy of the ocean data is pretty horrendous, so that doesn't help much. What about the models? Well, what these figures illustrate is that all the models pretty much exaggerate the observed warming. The top figures are for surface temperature. And we see this is observed trend, and this is the distribution of the models used by the IPCC. You see two curves here. This is 1998 to 2012. This is 1993 to 2012. Why do I have these two? Because people complained that 98 was an El Nino year. So starting, any other year, you get the same result, basically. This is for atmospheric temperature from John Christie and Spencer. And again, these are the IPCC models. This is the observation. Okay, so what do we have here? There are two non-mutually exclusive possibilities. One is that there is the existence of what's called natural internal variability that canceled the predicted warming. It's possible, but if that's true, it vitiates the IPCC argument of attribution, which assumed there was no such thing. The other is that the models are exaggerating warming, which is a simple enough possibility. Now, the second possibility relates to something called sensitivity. And this is something by convention refers to the equilibrium warming that would arise from a doubling of CO2. With everything else held fixed, it would be about 1 degree centigrade. The greater model responses depend on what are called positive feedbacks. That is, say, the system amplifies anything that you're doing. The feedbacks are due to water vapor in clouds, which everyone, including the IPCC, acknowledges are basically unknown. And the observations thus far demonstrate that the main feedback does not exist, the so-called water vapor feedback. That's true of my own work with Choi, but also Kevin Drenberth and Fasullo and so on have confirmed the same thing. In general, for long-lasting systems, and I would regard, 4.5 billion years as long-lasting, they're not usually dominated by positive feedbacks. The response of warming enthusiasts to the failure of temperature to increase significantly in the past 18 years has been to insist that many of the past 18 years have been among the warmest years on record. Now, what you'll see below is how silly and irrelevant this claim is, and I think it's also indicative of the dishonesty of the alarmists. This is a schematic of the temperature record. I haven't bothered to plot it. You have the line in the middle, the temperature went up roughly from 1920 to 1940. It decreased till the 1970s. It increased again between about 1978 and 1998 and stayed relatively constant after 1998. Well, what can you say about this? Well, you can certainly say that 18 of the 18 warmest years on record have been the last 18 years. It has nothing to do with the trend. The red lines indicate the uncertainty. And here there's plenty of room to play around, and a lot of playing around has occurred. One was Tommy Carl, who is with the US Weather Bureau, essentially, in charge of their climate statistics. And prior to the Paris conference, he adjusted these temperatures, basically to pretty much get rid of the cooling and to insist that there was warming all the way to the end. Since then, almost everyone has rejected this, but I think the crucial thing to know about this is that even with this attempt, it didn't change the fact that almost all models were predicting more than this observed warming. This is a case where you got the public to accept that any degree of warming was dangerous. And so if you could convert the flat part to an increase while decreasing the increasing part without changing the trend, you nevertheless have convinced people there was a danger. Oh well, despite the dubious nature of climate alarm, we're indoctrinating a generation of young people with this foolishness. Here's something that was in the Paris metro prior to the Paris Climate Conference. It was paid for by the World Wildlife Federation, and clearly it's assuming that these young people, in imitation of the Delacroix painting of the storming of the Bastille, have never heard of photosynthesis. They're arguing for the elimination of CO2. They presumably don't realize that all life would then end. But what the hell? One suspects the World Wildlife Federation actually knows better and is being intentionally deceptive. But it's hard to be sure. And the ridiculous narrative has satisfied the need of many for a transcendental cause to replace traditional religion. And like religion, it often treats deviations as evil. What then would a legitimate scientific question be? And the only one I can think of is, have we seen anything sufficiently unusual to justify concern? And I think the answer to this is unambiguously no. For instance, the IPCC refers to the warming from 1978 until 1998 as being due to man, but the warming from 1919 to 1939 not being due to man. They're identical. If you look through the last 600 million years, most of that has been much higher CO2, and there is no relation we see with temperature or climate. The claims of increasing droughts and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes and sea level rise are not only contradicted by the IPCC itself, but also by the data. Here are the two temperatures in the period I'm mentioning, one due to nature, one allegedly due to us. Can you really tell the difference? Here you have, the paleo records of carbon dioxide. Obviously, there's a lot of disagreement. There isn't disagreement that it was typically several times today's level. And it's pretty evident from the proxy temperatures that there wasn't much of a correlation, if any, between the two. Even the UN backs off of the issue of extremes, and the reason is simple. The evidence isn't there, though. That doesn't affect the popular narrative. I mean, here, what is this one? Average number of daily high temperatures above a certain amount as a function of time. Here you have various, forest fires, wildfires. There's no indication of trends in floods, droughts, so on. Go on indefinitely. But let's return to the science for a moment. And I'll try and finish up quite quickly. You're all aware that the greenhouse effect is settled science, with an ancient lineage going back to the early 19th century. You could argue whether Tyndall really understood it and so on, but I don't care. Has it never bothered you that it was only since the late 1980s that there was any concern over this? There are, in fact, several reasons. The first, of course, is virtually no one considered mild warming to be undesirable. There was hardly any Panglossian assumption that the climate at any given moment was the best of all possible climates. Certainly for Arrhenius, for Calendar, and so on, warming seemed like a good idea. More importantly, it was widely understood that climate was something that depended on many factors and was not a simple one-parameter family. Without minimizing the role of the greenhouse effect, it's been long recognized that other processes are likely to have played a more important role in the Earth's climate history. This book here was from 1955, called The Dynamics of Climate. The interesting thing about this book is it had contributions from every major figure, at least in the American and European climate scene, practically. Jules Charney, Norm Phillips, Ed Lorenz, Joe Smagorinsky, Victor Starr, etc. These names might not be familiar to you, but they were, until the 80s, considered the major leaders in the field. In this book, only one article dealt with radiative transfer, and it did not focus on the greenhouse effect, though increasing CO2 was briefly mentioned. The most important problem was explaining the tropics to pole temperature difference. Now, that is not, this, by the way, is John von Neumann, who headed one of the institutes sponsoring this meeting. The reason for this is it was already known that major climate regimes were characterized by extremely different temperature differences between the equator and the pole. So, for instance, today, roughly speaking, it's 40 degrees. During the glacial periods of the Ice Age cycles, it was closer to 60 degrees. And during the Eocene 50 million years ago, in what was known at the time, until this issue, warm climates were referred to as equable climates, meaning specially advantageous. It was closer to 20 degrees. Now, to give you an example of what kind of absurdity we've been pushed into, changes in equator to pole temperature difference usually mean changes in the flow of heat between the tropics and the pole. Something is holding the equator, in each of these cases, reasonably constant. Now, if you had gas in a piston, as in this figure here, there's no problem. Force will determine the pressure in the piston. But when you have flow of something, to assume it's the mean pressure rather than the pressure difference is patently absurd. And yet, this is the kind of thinking that permeates this issue, that it's the mean that determines it. And it's a good example of the power of a narrative to corrupt rational assessment. Note that for major climate changes, the change in global mean temperature is a residue of the change in the temperature difference. And residues are generally not what drive things. And this is some arithmetic, and I won't bother much, but let's say, you have latitude between the equator and the pole, and this is the edge of what is called the Hadley cell, where temperature is homogenized, and then you have the temperature decreasing toward the pole by an amount delta T2. And this is sine of latitude, so this would be roughly a half. At any rate, if you get back there, if you want to calculate the mean temperature, it would be the change in delta T1, change in T1, and it would also be, half the change due to delta T2. In any event, this leads to some very crazy conclusions, and the paleoclimatology community has been pretty bad on this. Let's say you had a situation, for instance, where the sensitivity was almost zero. So there was no change in delta T1. There was only a change in this little delta T2. So you'd have a change in the mean, but you had no greenhouse forcing. What would you conclude the sensitivity was? If you're a paleoclimatologist, you assume it's infinite. And that's what they're doing. It exaggerates it greatly. Even for more reasonable situations, it's entirely possible to conclude a high sensitivity when you've just dealt with the wrong process. In any event, one of the things I have to admit on this is, even for me and others, once you start the narrative on the greenhouse effect, you get everyone working on the greenhouse effect. What's the sensitivity due to that? And it basically succeeded in getting people to forget about anything else dealing with climate. And in my opinion, that set back climate science at least a generation. Okay, what is the true situation? As we've said, the demonized molecule CO2, which in America is referred to by the EPA as carbon pollution, is certainly not toxic. I don't know, how many of you have an idea? We currently have about 400 parts per million volume. Might have about twice that level here because people are breathing. What is the value permitted in a nuclear submarine or in the space station? It's about 5,000 parts per million volume. I mean, this is, not harmful. And it is vital to plant life. And NASA has done a pretty good job of establishing the contribution of increased CO2 to the increase in green areas in the Earth. And that's actually impressive. I mean, that gets close to $1 trillion in agricultural productivity. On the other hand, so even the warming itself is reckoned to be a benefit at modest levels for agriculture. There was an American political humorist called H.L. Mencken, and he made a wise observation. The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by an endless series of hobgoblins, most of them imaginary. And I think this is one of them. When it comes to climate alarm, this has gone much too far. We're wasting trillions of dollars to avoid a beneficial change. And this is probably more absurd than what Mencken imagined. The movement has become huge. With its growth has come increasing damage to the environment, to science, to the economy, and the prospects of the world's poor. I think it's time to put the brakes on climate alarm. To be sure, many who benefit from the alarm financially, politically, or emotionally will defend it with passion, but this can't be an excuse for the harm being done. The benefits of ending the alarm would be immense, and they would come with immense savings rather than expenditures. I think that's pretty unique in policy suggestions. Now, one last thing. In this talk, I haven't addressed certain issues. Only moderately the issue of 97% of scientists agree. I haven't dealt with polar bears or Arctic ice or sea level and so on. In my opinion, these are too silly for an intelligent audience, but I actually dealt with them in a recent paper for a student newspaper, and the conclusion may be worth repeating, and I'll read it. And it makes me wonder why physicists, why other scientists actually go along with this. There's one thing that should spark skepticism in any intelligent reader. We're looking at a system that consists in two turbulent fluids, the ocean and the atmosphere. They're interacting with each other. They're on a rotating planet that is differentially heated by the sun. A vital constituent of the atmospheric component is water in the liquid, solid, and vapor phases, and the changes in phase have vast energetic ramifications. The energy budget of this system involves the absorption and re-emission of 200 watts per square meter, Doubling CO2 involves a 2% perturbation to this budget. So do minor changes in clouds and other features, and such features are altogether common. In this complex multi-factor system, what is the likelihood of the climate, which itself consists in many variables and not just globally average temperature anomaly, is controlled by the 2% perturbation in a single variable? I would argue that believing this is pretty close to believing in magic. Instead, you're told that it is believing in science. Such a claim should be a clue that something is wrong. Science is a mode of inquiry rather than a belief structure. Thank you.